Uachtaráin Ianna Uisle an gédal si as smídlam cógórdachas a dhéanamh leis an alamh díocs agus leis an cloiste ailscoile bailio clia as acáidin le nniu I hallan ráile éagrú. Bhí óthas am ghlacú leis an cuireadh tíocht agus a rud ó thuairt ag an críniú seo a hagan le chéile daoine aoinear as ceannarí ó réimsí lechan éacreachta úl buinteacha le glíomh daonúil in éireann agus thar lá. President of the University, distinguished guests, Minister Flanagan, Minister Sherlock, Aguni Cora Fox. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being asked to open this very important conference. As I have just said, that I was anxious to congratulate Professor Deeks and University College Dublin for hosting today's event in O'Reilly Hall. I was delighted to be asked to speak at the opening of today's event, and I think, knowing too so many of you here, that the community that is gathered to concentrate today on what it means to be humanitarian is a community of concern that includes academics, non-governmental organizations, United Nations agencies, public and private sector representatives, and very importantly, members of the diaspora communities here in Ireland. I have decided to concentrate as well on the thinking that I think we must now introduce if we are to make the best possible contribution in Istanbul next year. Ireland has a lengthy history of humanitarian engagement, and that record constitutes a tradition that has become strongly linked to the positive aspects of Irish identity. The experiences of famine and of immigration are to be expected, of course, as influences on Ireland's foreign policy in general and its approach to overseas aid in particular. The early architects of Ireland's foreign policy had a very defined sense of Ireland's history and political traditions as having provided our country with a specific ethical and emancipatory perspective on world affairs. And this view was widely shared by the Irish people. There were a body of values that gave us, as it were, a derived from our own experience set of practices in foreign policy. And thus, whether it was in response to the war in Biafra in the 1960s, the famines in Bangladesh and Ethiopia in the 1970s and 80s, or the response to the tsunami and Haiti earthquake in more recent times, and all of those crises in between, Irish people have shown time and again an eagerness to offer their help to the suffering and to the most vulnerable. Irish people, in making that response, are embracing their responsibilities as global citizens, a concept now fleeing away from us, perhaps, not as usual in the rhetoric as it was some years ago, challenging even, global citizens. The Irish state delivers these values then, which are in the consciousness of its people, through our foreign policy and through the important work of Irish aid, but of course through the work of the Irish NGOs, so many of you are present in the room today. The efforts of Irish humanitarian workers in the field are in turn then, they're highly respected within the humanitarian sector for their commitment and professionalism. And then too, I am very well aware of those Irish people who've risen to senior positions within international aid agencies, as is evident with many of the guests who are gathered in the room this morning. Irish Aid's much commended Rapid Response Initiative. It is very important in its harnessing of the expertise of Irish humanitarian professionals from across a wide range of professions, deploying them to crises across the globe at short notice when needed. As President, and before that, as a member of the Dáil and Sean's Foreign Affairs Committee, I've had indeed the privilege that you referred to, President, of visiting many of the heroic projects supported or administered by Irish humanitarians in difficult circumstances around the world. I have witnessed the work of Irish Aid and its Irish and international partners firsthand during my more recent visits to Lebanon this year and to Ethiopia in 2014. In Ethiopia, I visited camps for South Sudanese refugees fleeing the conflict, which has engulfed the world's newest state. Hundreds of thousands of people have sought shelter in Gambela in Ethiopia, while 1.5 million more are internally displaced within South Sudan's own borders. I have some difficulties sometimes about the sheer length of the word humanitarian, as if to some extent, in a way, it could become a kind of residual ex post facto used word. And I will seek in what I have to say to try and engage with the first half of the word, which is human. And while our humanitarian action may have been shaped then, I've alluded to it already, by our domestic cultural and political identity from within, a factor which has helped to shape our national identity on the global stage, Ireland's humanitarian and development work is also grounded on very important contemporary values for which we struggle. Values of solidarity, community, democracy, justice, freedom, and respect for human rights and equality. And in addressing the current humanitarian context, I believe we must invoke these values not as a form of predictable rhetoric to be encountered, but as guidance as to our future direction and as constituent elements of our practice. And we must advocate this with global partners, because we are at a critical moment in world history, facing a series of tests and choices that will determine not only the fate of millions of our fellow global citizens now, but tests and choices that will define the future of our planet itself. I spoke in January at the launch of the European Year of Development of my belief that 2015 is on a par with 1945 in terms of the potential that it has to reshape how humanity deals with the challenges we face. By the end of this year, the post-2015 development agenda will have been finalized, and the new Sustainable Development Goals will be called upon to provide a roadmap for the future. And of course, Ireland has been honored, being given the great honor and responsibility of co-chairing with Kenya the negotiation process for finalizing the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, a new climate change agreement will have been signed in Paris. I've recently been invited by President Hollande to address a preliminary conference in Paris later this month on the theme of Summit of Consciences for the Climate. These two processes of sustainable development and responding to climate change are profoundly interconnected with each other, of course, and they both directly inform the current humanitarian context. In each area, development, climate change, and displacement, we will be required to undertake the rigorous intellectual work that should inform good policy and best practice. Intellectual work that will allow us to recognize the contours, complexities, and most crucially, the causes of our current situation. It is a matter of concern as to whether the will for such engaged scholarship exists at the present time. It is weak by comparison to other decades. Certainly, it seems missing from current discourse at the political and institutional level. We will need political and moral leadership that is courageous and far-sighted and grounded in the founding values of human rights. In the spheres of law, policy, and diplomacy, we must accept our obligations and duties in an interdependent world, obligations that may be indeed grounded in international law, but that run deeper to the level of moral and ethical obligations. The World Humanitarian Summit, which will be held in Istanbul on the 26th and 27th of May 2016, has been called by United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at a time when the humanitarian crisis facing the world is unprecedented in its scale and in its complexity. The Secretary General has done so as an acknowledgement of the urgency of the situation and of its global nature. That word occurs again and again in his pleas to the international community to get past their narrow boundaries. The World Summit will address the humanitarian consequences of both natural disasters and the consequences that flow from war and conflict. I wish to focus then today on the dramatic increase in humanitarian need that we are currently witnessing as a result of just some particular wars and political collapses in Africa and Asia. Let us first, however, be unequivocal that this present crisis of displacement is not an issue that can be compartmentalized in a silo that we might simply label security, or externalized as simply a regional concern for some. Both responses would be morally inadequate and, in my view, would not simply reflect well on us. It is a global issue which is directly and primarily concerned with the protection of human rights. And in approaching this issue, I suggest we must make a fresh commitment to the universality of human rights and to the common humanity of all that we must understand if we are to understand the current humanitarian crisis. The word humanitarian worked back to humanity, worked back to human, worked back to dignity. I think that we must understand that our current humanitarian crisis and construct our own position in relation to it in a proper historical context. The alternative is to choose short-term and short-sighted responses based on a narrow sense of national self-interest, a choice that would be for humanity in general and for our shared future on this planet little short of disastrous. So let us begin by considering the true nature of what we're witnessing at present. As recently confirmed by the United Nations Commission for Refugees, the number of refugees and displaced persons is now at its highest level since figures were first recorded in the 1950s. Global forced displacement has seen accelerated growth in 2014, once again reaching unprecedented levels. By the end of 2014, 59.5 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or human rights violation. That was an increase of 8.3 million persons on the previous year, and it was the highest annual increase in any single year. Now, to date, the response to addressing the humanitarian reality behind these population numbers and these immediate increases, and to addressing the root causes driving people to move, has been, in my view, wholly inadequate. In recent months, we in Europe have seen these great humanitarian challenges becoming manifest in the Mediterranean, where this year alone almost 2,000 people have already died in attempting to make the perilous journey across the sea, fleeing conflict, or grinding poverty, or both, or simply hoping for a better life. Ireland's Ellie Ethna, in its first weeks of deployment in the Mediterranean, has rescued more than 2,700 desperate migrants from unseaworthy craft of various shapes and sizes. Unseaworthy craft of various shapes and sizes you will see referred to in those vessels which the Irish used to get to Canada immediately after the Great Famine. But while retaining, and I do say this, the important distinction, the integrity of the distinction between aid and militarism, It is a crucial distinction that I recognize and has my support. Nevertheless, it is a fundamental principle that the scale of drowning we have witnessed in the first months of this year demands emergency action. And as Supreme Commander of the Defence Forces, I suggest I speak for all of the Irish people when I say how proud we are that our naval forces have been making this contribution and will continue to do so. The numbers of lives which have been lost on Europe's southern and eastern borders have been truly shocking. And we must recognize that this is a human, not a natural phenomenon. All these movements are not some form of influenza. They have causes that are capable of being known, capable of being addressed. In all regions, this present increased level of displacement has specific causes. In Africa and in the Middle East, too, we are seeing great levels of displacement prompted by war and conflict and by catastrophic failures of politics and of development strategies. Conflict in Libya and the neighboring African countries continues to push migrants into boats on the Mediterranean, while the conflict in Syria continues to push refugees across the borders into Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. More than half of all refugees worldwide, as recognized by the UNHCR, came from just 3 countries. Syria, 3.88 million, Afghanistan, 2.59 million, and Somalia, 1.1 million. The current migration crisis is not solely or even predominantly a European problem. Many of those displaced will go on to seek protection in Europe, but most will stay in neighboring states, where we must never forget the great majority of the world's refugees are to be found this morning. The leading host countries for refugees are not the most developed states, but those neighbors who receive grossly inadequate support. At the end of 2014, Turkey hosted 1.59 million refugees, Pakistan 1.51 million. Lebanon, a country with a total population of less than 4.5 million, hosted 1.15 million. Iran, 982,000. Ethiopia, 659,500. Jordan, 654,100. Given this reality, we must interrogate how much of our discourse has focused on questions of security and border control, on that old chestnut of migration theory, pull factors, to the neglect of the reality of the conditions from which people are leaving and the conditions where they subsequently find themselves. Analyzing the UNHCR figures, we're confronted with the many contradictions in how developed countries currently approach the movement of people from areas of conflict on our planet. As the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has noted, we cannot ask those countries to keep their borders open and the other borders to close. The High Commissioner has correctly identified that this is an untenable position. Worse, we are failing to support these countries with the anticipated consequence that the global situation will deteriorate further for them and for us. As the High Commissioner has described the receiving states, those neighbors who opened their borders, this is what he said: they are the first line of defense for global collective security, and they are pillars, essential pillars for regional security. If they fall, the consequences would be dramatic for the whole world. We must recognize, too, that much of this migration catastrophe flows from political and diplomatic failures, and more frequently neglect of indicators of forthcoming conflicts and confrontations. But Ireland is active. In 2014, Ireland provided almost €15 million in funding to address the Syria crisis. And so far in 2015, 3.3 million has been provided to United Nations agencies. 1.5 million for the World Food Programme, 1 million for UNICEF, 800,000 for UNHCR Jordan for the Syria response. On the 31st of March 2015, at the Third International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria in Kuwait. Kuwait 3, Minister of State Sherlock announced a pledge of €12 million on behalf of the Irish government, bringing the total value of Ireland's contribution to the Syria crisis to €41 million. Internationally, however, as recently reported by Amnesty International, only 23% of the United Nations humanitarian appeal for Syria's refugees has been funded. And behind that stands that other great ghost of this discourse, those who make pledges but do not honour them. As a result of this funding shortage, aid agencies have repeatedly had to reduce financial assistance to refugees. The immediate consequence of this failure to fund or resettle refugees from the war is that the neighbouring states are unable to cope and are increasingly imposing restrictions on those fleeing from fighting. Most of those arriving in Italy by boat or being rescued in the central Mediterranean are leaving from Libya, a country facing great political difficulties with no functioning asylum system. Libyan authorities have little capacity to prevent migrants leaving their shores, and there is no indication that the numbers coming to Libya from other states will decrease. Little is being done to support the authorities in Libya, and European states and institutions have been at best slow to agree a response that would remove the impulse for desperate people to get into the boats in the first instance, or provide safe pathways to protection or resettlement in frontline states. Again and again we encounter not just a reluctance but a resistance to acknowledge the consequences of diplomatic failure, to learn from that failure, or to take responsibility for it in terms of strategy and in diplomacy. The response, such as it has been to date, has focused heavily on border controls, security, and targeting those who are smuggling migrants across frontiers. These steps are, of course, necessary as part of a comprehensive strategy. But the emphasis to date has been misplaced. Any suggestion that the current situation can be resolved with such measures alone is misguided and may lead to security consequences that are far more dangerous to Europe in the longer term. I believe that the reality of the present situation, including its historical origins and perspective, has become obscured, and so too have the moral and ethical issues at stake for institutions, international organizations, and national governments and their populations. The dangers that we face include the danger that in ceding to historical and statist exceptionalism, we might lose sight of, or even lose completely, the universality of human rights and human dignity on which our international order is expressed. At stake, then, is the moral force and authority of the international system itself and that of the regions of destination. The principle of universality, on universality of rights and human dignity, as expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is of course the very foundation of the United Nations itself. And this principle, our common humanity in all its dimensions, must be our starting point. I met with Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, at Áras an Uachtaráin just a few weeks ago. And we discussed the challenges associated with the global crisis of migration and refugees. To mark World Refugee Day just 2 days earlier, the Secretary General had said, refugees are people like anyone else, like you and me. They lead ordinary lives before becoming displaced, and their biggest dream is to be able to live normally again. Let us recall our common humanity, celebrate tolerance and diversity, and open our hearts to refugees everywhere. When we consider the obligations and responsibilities that flow from that reference to common humanity, the common humanity that we all purport to share, the position of civilians fleeing war should not be alien to any nation, including those that currently enjoy prosperity and peace. I've spoken elsewhere and in different contexts about what I have called the ethics of memory, about the importance of how we remember the past to the challenge of building better futures. One of the great dangers of forgetting our own past is that we can have a false sense of security about a present we don't really understand, or come to view contemporary differences between us and others as essential rather than determined, or more accurately contingent, made by events, often by new and unaccountable forces. We have all shared a troubled history, and our systems and standards of protection were put in place at the midpoint of a troubled century when many European nations witnessed enormous destruction and displacement. And if compassion is to be grounded in empathy, then we would all do well to remember ethically the experiences of our own forebears. For Ireland, we remember that among the 1 million who fled famine and disease during a very few short years, many were driven to make perilous journeys in inadequate vessels to harbors of populations which at times rejected them with hostility. But we remember so much better those populations who accepted them and afforded them the opportunity to begin new lives. For all European nations, the memory of the refugee experience should be within the reach of 1 or 2 generations. The level of displacement across this continent, both during and after World War II, left few regions untouched. For example, well over 10 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern and Central Europe, or left voluntarily between 1945 and 1950. The refugee camps established at the end of World War II were only finally closed in Europe in 1960. Even in more recent history, Europe has faced large refugee movements within its own borders. In the 1990s in the Balkans, when 2.7 million people were displaced and 700,000 sought asylum in Western Europe. At the global level too, the world has met such challenges before, and the international response to the wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos in the 1970s ultimately saw millions of civilians resettled in North America, Europe, and Australasia. We must reject, then, any exceptionalism which would seek to define the current crisis as being unprecedented or beyond our capacity. Our human rights obligations under United Nations treaties and under the European Convention are universal, and they are non-derogable. They are also unreservedly and unquestionably to be applied without discrimination on the grounds of legal status, race, religion, or nationality. As to the extent of these obligations, in the first instance, there are the obligations to protect the right to life of those we are directly confronted with at sea. In the case of the Mediterranean, the European Union must do so much more to expand search and rescue operations, and these missions must be prioritized over concerns about controls. Yes, comprehensive long-term solutions must be found to reduce current flows of people across the Mediterranean. But in the interim period, we cannot accept that deterrence ever justifies the loss of life. There is also the non-derogable right to freedom from non-refoulement, which we are seeing being blatantly violated in Southeast Asia and elsewhere at this time. Again, the need for regional cooperation and coordinated action, or its absence, or difficulty, cannot justify tactical responses that risk and continue to risk the loss of life. At the level of national governments, we need to have in place robust domestic refugee systems that are fair, equitable, and efficient. In the Irish context, I do welcome the publication this week of the report of the Working Group on Improvements to the Protection Process, including direct provision and supports to asylum seekers. Adequacy and transparency of process are important, but we must recognize that the scale of the numbers needing protection unequivocally will require substantive and generous action. Beyond the immediate issue of search and rescue and receiving refugees, and that of supporting institutions in the frontline countries, we must also look at resettlement. In framing its response to this great challenge, the international community has a moral as well as a legal obligation not merely to rescue those crammed into often makeshift and extremely dangerous vessels, but to provide long-term solutions afterwards. UNHCR estimates that in 2014, 378,684, just more than a third of a million people in the 5 main host countries were in need of resettlement. However, to date, the number of places offered to these most vulnerable of Syria's refugees, who have been determined to be unlikely to return safely to Syria at any foreseeable point, stands at 87,442. Amnesty is among those organizations who have called for an international number of 300,000 per year. Even within Europe itself, we might also ask, what does solidarity mean in relation to migration and asylum policy? Italy, Malta, and Greece, undergoing its own tragedy, cannot be abandoned or expected to fulfill Europe's duties on their own, simply by virtue of geography. Taken together, the universal and non-derogable rights, the right to life, the right to freedom of torture, non-refoulement, represent the core values of the institutional framework that was put in place after the Second World War in order to promote peace in the world. If Europe is to fulfill or recapture the vision of its founders, then it must be a Europe built on respect for basic human rights, for dignity, including economic and social rights, and respects for the rights of migrants and refugees. If we allow these rights to be diluted by the rhetoric of prejudice and fear, we risk undermining the moral legitimacy of our various positions on the world stage, and we will be remembered for it. This in turn will weaken, and perhaps is already weakening, our influence and capacity to act in response to the very real threats to these values and other parts of our planet. Fundamentalism and extremism are at the heart of the conflicts that are driving the greater number of those who are displaced, often accompanied by a rhetoric of hate about the purported conflict between faith-based values and those of what it is suggested that is the decadent West. A rise of extremism in one corner of the world has the potential to affect us all. And if we sustain large levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, we offer such populations as prey to those who will abuse them with such instruments. And while technological and communication advances have offered us such great benefits of innovation and capability, they can also be harnessed for ill, and in their use, the threat of such extremism can spread and flourish faster than ever before. We cannot hope to succeed in defeating extremism by deepening systems of othering those who are arriving in Europe seeking our protection. So I suggest humbly that this is a moment for leadership that is courageous, that might be grounded in an unqualified commitment to human rights and informed by a long-sighted understanding of the gravity of the present situation. This is a moment for European leaders to engage in the public space with their parliaments and with their electorates. And rather than yielding to new populisms, themselves based on fear and eroding security, make the case for solidarity and protection. Are we to be limited in our actions by the narrow self-interest of the present, to regress, or are we to fulfill the duties bestowed on us by the principles of universal human rights, by our own debt to history, and by our obligations to the future? These are the questions we must answer. And while it is appropriate that serving the needs of people in conflict has been chosen as a core theme of the World Humanitarian Summit preparations, responding to the consequences of conflict is not enough. The international community must also consider how to take such preventative action as will best enable them to engage actively in advance of conflicts. More and more, the international community is simply and often inadequately reacting to the worst events after they have happened. The current crisis is the product of failed diplomacy, a failure that all the international community shares, and that the powerful share more than most. We are witnessing the sapping away of the authority and influence of a necessary and genuine internationalism. At the same time, I do want to recognize those swimming against the tide, those who continue to act for sustainable peace and security. They must be supported, and it is the responsibility of us all to work through multilateral institutions and reinvigorated diplomatic channels to promote peace where it is absent and to sustain it where it is fragile. And alongside our aid programme and policy engagement, Ireland continues to play an important role through the international peacekeeping operations that it supports. Within 3 years of joining the United Nations, we were activists. The first contingent of Irish peacekeepers were deployed as part of an observer mission to Lebanon in 1958. Since then, Ireland's commitment to Blue Helmet peacekeeping has remained unbroken, and it is probably the most visible expression of Ireland's support for the United Nations. When I visited the Irish contingent of peacekeepers, which forms part of the UNIFIL mission in Lebanon earlier this year, I was struck by the quiet, sustained, and sensitively delivered professionalism of Irish soldiers and members of An Garda Síochána, who make incredible sacrifices to bring peace and stability in places where it is fragile or threatened. Other factors that are contributing, of course, to global instability must be addressed. The effects of climate change make international borders appear ever more irrelevant. Humanity's interdependence in the fullest sense across borders, oceans, continents is apparent in the face of any and more frequently occurring typhoon, flood, or drought. And those most affected by these climate changes-related events are those who are already the poorest and most vulnerable. Global inequality, which we refuse to address, most strikingly is exemplified in the manner in which climate change most affects those who have least contributed to it. These interlinked and recurrent emergencies that climate change contributes to, they require interlinked global solutions. We must recognize that solidarity that binds us all together as human beings and acknowledge that we all share a responsibility towards this fragile planet and a duty of hospitality towards all those who live on it. In its essence, our shared task is to recapture the dimension of humanity within this humanitarian crisis. We must never simply reduce our experience to some form of nameless quantification. And I am pleased to note that the overarching theme of the Irish Humanitarian Summit has been chosen as they put it, putting affected people at the center of humanitarian response. The first responders in any emergency, whether natural or man-made, are the people affected. Neighbors share food with those without. Relatives share shelter families forced to evacuate their homes. These responders are the most effective in addressing the real and immediate needs of the crisis affected. The global humanitarian community needs to recognize this and incorporate it into existing and strengthen coordination and response structures. By focusing on those affected and treating them as key agents in their own recovery and development, with all the respect and dignity that it calls forth, respect for their cultures and context, then the global humanitarian community can begin to make real progress in saving lives, enabling communities to improve their position and even to flourish. In order to help communities reduce their vulnerability to disasters before they strike, humanitarian agencies need to learn from the communities themselves, with their instinctive intelligence and their inherited indigenous wisdom, what the risks are, and incorporate the community's existing coping mechanisms into their work. Similarly, the concept of resilience and building communities' own abilities to mitigate the effects of disasters can only be done by harnessing such local knowledge. It is the harnessing of local knowledge coupled as necessary with external expertise, which I believe will see the greatest strides forward in helping communities to withstand shocks and transform their societies by building back, as it were, better from before disasters. Taking into account the position of women in both development and humanitarian practice, I couldn't emphasize it enough. We must recognize that women are disproportionately and uniquely affected by disasters and armed conflict. Ireland's second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security recognizes both the particularly adverse effect of conflict on women and girls, as well as their critical role in conflict prevention, peace negotiations, peace building and governance. It was with enormous pleasure that in March this year I accepted the invitation of the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director, UN Women, to become one of 10 world global champions for the United Nations Women He for She campaign. That global movement has at its core the principle of solidarity. It is a movement that seeks to bring one half of humanity together in support of the other half of humanity. I look forward to making my own modest contribution in carrying out this role with passion and energy in the months ahead. Mar focal skill concrete to conclude. As we take up this important work of preparation for these summits on development, climate change, and the humanitarian crisis, my hope is that world leaders involved will make wise and brave, and yes, the necessary radical decisions. The European Union and other international institutions and member states must commit to fully and comprehensively address the protracted conflicts, civil unrest, or cyclical food crises, which drive so many of our global fellow citizens to such desperate measures. We must propose solutions that acknowledge cooperation, interdependence, solidarity, departing from individual and national self-interest. Positions which prevail, for example, to an unedifying degree in the current European discourse on so many of these issues. Harna spricken agus na galtanis, na rochas bartish, agus na fogra, ta sé riacna na gomardiship Ibraha Kaurach, Parliamentori, Lochlane agus Gnivig, ein dal, le golorach of Sakaludasha, Kuntagus Canary Danda, kun Kintago Gunin shid na galtanis rinishid. Beyond the goals and commitments, the policy statements and the declarations, it is essential that aid workers, parliamentarians, academics, activists, like so many of you in the room today, hold world leaders to account and ensure that they deliver on the promises they make to our shared humanity. As we prepare for the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul next year, today's gathering marks an important opportunity for the Irish humanitarian community to provide recommendations on how best we can respond to crisis. And in doing so, you can ensure that those most affected will have the agency and resources necessary to not only survive, but to tackle the root causes of these crises and have the capacity to absorb, adapt, to transform shocks and stresses in their own communities, drawing on the riches of their own shared collective memories, with their own strategies respected, and their own normative visions for community security, not only made possible, but assisted. And in opening this Irish Humanitarian Summit today, that is the message I have to bring. I urge you as the key humanitarian activists in Ireland to propose bold and tangible proposals for realizing this urgent appeal. The most vulnerable people on our fragile planet require your intervention, your solidarity. They are entitled to no less if we are to hope together for a better and more secure world. Garamak.